queen endgames are tough, and this is no exception. A 2660 player, Johan-Sebastian Christiansen, didn't hold this with black pieces. Before we start, I have to mention what both sides have to do in this endgame. Black is hoping for some perpetual check, hoping to use the exposed king, but he has to give checks in such a way that white doesn't cover. For example, right now the queen on h5 is quite passive on the edge of the board, doesn't cover that many squares as it could in the center, let's say on d5 or d4. So black has to do checks which can't be covered with either pawn or queen. What white has to do? White has to somehow improve his queen to cover more squares and to protect from checks. Also, black has to be careful that some of his checks don't follow up with counter check and the queen trade, because the king is so far from the pawn and any pawn ending would be lost for black. So let's get to the game. Black played queen h1, gave a check which cannot be covered. King goes to g4, and now I think he makes a small inaccuracy. He goes queen e4. I think better was to go queen d1 and black has a forced draw. For example, if king goes up, not queen d5, because king goes to h6 and queen will go to g6 and g5, depending on where black gives a check. If it's queen d2, then queen g5, and white slowly improves the position. Queen is much better on g5 than on h5, and it will become increasingly difficult to give checks with black. But black has queen d2, using the fact that g3 pawn is now loose, and white cannot advance by king g6 because of queen d6, and you pick up the g3 pawn. So white would have to go, let's say, to f5, but then queen f2 attacks the pawn, forcing the king to go back to g4, but then queen e2, king h4, and we repeat position. After queen h2, king g4, queen e2, king g5, and again queen d2. So I believe that after queen g4, queen d1 was the cleanest way to a draw. In the game, black played queen e4 check. After king g5, now black made a mistake by queen e5. He had to play queen e7. And the point is, if king goes to g6, we have again this queen d6 using the loose pawn on g3. And if king h6, now you don't give a check on f6 or e6 because of queen g6 and white improves. But you go queen f8, giving a check that cannot be covered. And if king h7, queen e7, and it's not possible for white to cover from checks. But instead black played queen e5, and after king h4, now it's tough to give a check that cannot be covered. Black tried with queen e4, but now g4 was played and white slowly improves. Now the g-pawn is not loose anymore, and it's easier for white to cover from checks, and also to advance his king to 6th or 7th rank. Black continued with queen e1, king g5, and now the king goes up the board. Queen e6, and now king g7. Black wanted to play queen d7 to stop queen f7, because g-pawn is loose, so you can't go here, but the king escapes to h6 instead. Black gives a check on d6, but now the queen is improving, gets to g6, black gives a check, king goes to g7, and one more check, but the queen is creeping up. Queen e5, and now king h7. Now black gave a check on e4, but white covers, and slowly centralizes his queen. Queen went to b7, and now king g8. And now let's stop for a moment. Now check on the b8 square is not good because of queen f8, forcing a queen trade and winning this endgame. So black decides to go queen b3, but queen f7. And for the first time, black doesn't have a good check, so he goes queen e3, at least stopping the g-pawn from running. And now white has to improve his queen's position by queen d5 check. Because before this, the g-pawn couldn't run. So white improves the queen by queen d5, and now pushes the pawn. Black has a check on e8, but white escapes. one more check, and now king h8. And once again, black is running out of checks, because any check like queen f8 or queen e8 is met with queen g8, exchanging queens and winning this endgame. So after queen e3, which was black's move, now once again white adjusts the position of his queen. Queen d6 check, and after king a8 he gave a check on c6, covering e8 check, and now pushes the pawn. After check on h3, king went to g7, king b8, and now the king goes to f6. Now it's exposed, but very soon it escapes the checks. And after king e7, black played queen g1. Because if he gives a check on e1, king goes to f8, and after one more check, king goes to g8 and pushes the g pawn. For example, if you go queen b1, now you don't have to push immediately. You can give a check, force the king on the 7th rank, and then push the pawn, because now check on b3 or a2 will be met by queen trade. Queen f7 check, and then you're forced to exchange queens. So black has to make a passed move by king b7, but in that case king f8, and again checks are not available because of a counter check. Queen f5, queen f7, or queen b4, queen e7. And also you might ask, what if king a6 here? In that case there's a check on a8, and when the king steps on the b file, queen b8, skewer. So black decides to go queen g1 instead. But now again you have to adjust your queen's position. Give a check and play king f7. The point of centralizing the queen on d5 is to make sure that there's no check on a2, on this diagonal, once the king goes to g8. After queen g3, white pushed the pawn, and now things are very, very hopeless for black. Queen went to b8. After king f7, black gave one more check. King f6, queen c3, and we had repetition of moves, but finally king went to e7, and now the check on the 7th rank is impossible because of queen d7, forcing a queen trade. So black chose check on b4. But now king goes to e8, queen b8 check, and now king d7. Now checks are gone, and the g-pawn promotes next move. So black tried to pull off a trick here, by queen b4. The point is, after g8 queen, what do you play for in such positions? Two queens versus queen. You play for a stalemate, so queen b5. And now white cannot take on b5, cannot take the queen, so he escapes. And after a couple of more checks, finally escapes in the corner, and any check on the h file is met with counter check. And this is why after king h8, black resigned, because there was no point in continuing, there's no stalemate anymore, and with two queens, white will easily give a checkmate to black's king. This endgame was quite difficult to understand, and I didn't try to pack it up with variations to make it even more complicating. I tried just to introduce some concepts like counter check, like improving the queen, which we saw a couple of times here. I didn't want to dig deeper into some lines, which I could, but the video would last like 2-3 hours maybe, and even then it would be very confusing, so I didn't want to do that. Yeah, the key moment was that didn't choose the clear path to a draw. Like after king g4, queen d1, and finding this queen d2 was probably something that threw off black. He didn't find queen d2, and he felt like he had to give a check on d5 maybe, but then king h6 would lead to a similar position as in the game. But, you know, after queen d2, the loose g pawn would be very, very big factor here. King cannot get to g6 because of queen d6, and it simplifies black's task of making a draw. It's much more forcing than what happened in the game. I believe if you don't have a forcing way to draw in such endings, it's very difficult to hold it. And also one more moment was queen e7 and finding this. But after queen e5, king h4 and the g-pawn began rolling, it was quite tough to deal with that, because now the g-pawn is not loose anymore and there's no way to force a draw with perpetual. The queen is free to go anywhere, king is also free to go to the 6th rank, unlike in the previous case when it was on g3. When the pawn was on g3, there was always some check which would take a pawn. So I hope you enjoyed this, I hope you learned something new, and if you liked the video, subscribe, like, and I'll see you soon.